Many revolutionaries are beginning to see the need to get past some of the darker moments in our histories, move beyond sectarianism to learn and draw from other radical traditions. As was put forward by Agitator Index, a collective which our speaker tonight, Joel Olson, was a core member of, the old split in the left used to be between anarchists and Marxists. This continues to be a strong division amongst the left, but many are now questioning and at times rejecting the schism, as it's becoming clear that many anarchists and Marxists are equally committed to building a free society. And alliances are increasingly being built between non-sectarians on both sides, specifically grassroots organizers coming out of anarchism and out of third world Marxism. So as far as we can tell, these are not just efforts at building a united front. These are not just alliances that are solely based upon finding some practical unity with which we can fight a common enemy in this period, which then breaks down once the left starts winning again. Rather, it's coming out of a real respect for one another's practice, politics, and figuring out how to take action together, and from a real desire to learn from one another in a context of no one tradition has all the answers. So fortunately, we have examples to look to where a similar fusion is taking place throughout contemporary Latin American social movements, but specifically through the Zapatistas, where concepts and organizations from multiple traditions, including the strong influences of anarchism and Marxism, are converging and forming a new politics and a new practice which draws the best from many revolutionary traditions. So it's very fitting that this event comes so closely on the heels of the recent Center for Political Education Forum on this booklet, Reclaiming Revolution, which former Storm comrades recently released on their history and lessons. We felt it was a perfect moment following up on that to highlight the history and lessons of very similar projects coming out of the anarchist tradition, both as a chance to learn about many of the vital contemporary lessons on building revolutionary organizations, which anarchism as a fighting working class politics has to offer, and as a way to deepen understanding of anarchist politics and history in general. So tonight we're very lucky to have Joel Olson with us, having traveled all the way with his family from Arizona. And as I'm sure folks have read in the flyer and in the announcement, Joel's here to speak to the history, politics, and lessons from a number of organizations and projects he has either been a member of, helped found, or has been in relation to over the past 15 or so years in the movement. Focusing specifically on the history of attempts to build serious revolutionary organizations, i.e. cadre organizations, upon politics and strategies which have emerged out of the anarchist tradition. So Joel will be speaking on the legacy and lessons of Love Rage Anarchist Federation, which was a national membership organization which, amongst many other things, pushed the North American anarchist movement to take seriously the roles of national liberation movements, and was one of the first primarily white anarchist groupings to make a serious commitment to fight white supremacy. After 8 years, Love and Rage dissolved amongst extremely interesting debates, which hopefully Joel will shed some light on. So Joel will also speak to two cadre organizations which developed out of and based on the experiences and lessons from Love and Rage. The first being the Fire by Night Organizing Committee, which Joel was not a member of, but was politically close to, at least I think, who, among other things, also pushed the centrality of white supremacy and the importance of national liberation movements, and the need to look outside of classical anarchism. Many may be familiar with them through their important summation and lessons document, After Winter Must Come Spring, which is on that back table and is also in this book, 8 years of writings from Love and Rage. Joel will also speak to, there are former members in the audience tonight who hopefully can fill in areas that Joel can't in terms of Fire by Night. So Joel will also be speaking to Bring the Ruckus, which is an organization that Joel and others founded around 2 years ago, around the present need for a highly disciplined national cadre organization that, among other things, engages in mass work with a class struggle orientation, which places the struggle against white supremacy at the strategic center. He'll also be bringing in his experiences working on the Race Trader Journal, and as an editor of the New Abolitionist newsletter, and as an editor also of The Blast out of Minneapolis. So folks, could please join me in welcoming Joel Olson.
Thank you very much. Is it hot in here, or am I just nervous as hell?
It's hot.
And I'm nervous as hell. But that's all right. I want to thank Study, Struggle, and the Catalyst Project for inviting me out here. I really appreciate that. I don't know if I deserve more than 6 people in a room at a time to listen to me, but I appreciate it. I'm also happy to see some old friends and comrades here, and of course my awesome family is here, and some current comrades and some people who I've met before. So hopefully meet some friends after tonight, and probably some enemies too, which is all good. That's what politics is about. As Josh says, my name is Joel Olson. I used to be in active in numerous anarchist organizations in Minneapolis from 92 to 96, and then from Phoenix from 96 to about 2 years ago, and now I live in Flagstaff, which I'll just say that and leave it at that. Yeah. And in that time, I was involved in various organizations within anarchist organizations in Minneapolis, Twin Cities Anarchist Federation, the Emma Center, Profane Existence, and then I was a member of Love Rage, and let's see, what else? And also a member of The Blast, which is a radical newspaper, very much along the lines of Love Rage. And then I'm also a member of Bring the Ruckus, and I was involved with the Race Trade Organization from '97 up until last summer was the last one we really did. As I give this talk, encourage you to feel free to ask any questions about any details, about history, about a clarification or something that I'm not making clear. Feel free to just interrupt and ask that question. If you have more substantive questions about debating or more substantive questions, I'll ask that you hold off. But if there's questions of clarification or history or detail, feel free to just jump in and ask. The first thing I like to do is to begin, and I hope it's okay that I walk around, otherwise I'll be even more boring than you're going to get. So, the first thing I'd like to do is to begin with the definition and understanding what a cadre organization is. And this kind of was one of the problems that Love and Rage constantly has. A lot of times, even our own members are like, now what the hell is Love and Rage for anyway? And I think there's a cadre organization is an important part of a revolutionary process. And so I want to talk about, to define a cadre organization, explain its purpose, the politics and the strategy behind a cadre organization. And then I'll talk about these organizations, which I consider all to be either cadre organizations or, in the case of Race Trader, perhaps a kind of a proto-cadre organization. But anyway, a cadre organization is simply a group of committed, active, revolutionary intellectuals who share a common politics and who come together to develop revolutionary struggle and thought, and then to test that thought out in practice. And by active, so when I say a group of committed, active revolutionary intellectuals, by active, I mean someone who is involved in political struggle, not just a book reader. And when I talk about an intellectual, I don't mean someone with a college degree. And as someone with too many college degrees, I'll say that that's usually an obstacle to being a revolutionary intellectual rather than an aid. So I don't mean someone with a college degree, but I mean someone who makes a serious, ongoing commitment to understand the world in order to better change it. That's all. And I would assume that most people in this room are intellectuals by that criteria. A cadre group is not a mass organization. It's not like a Janitors for Justice. It's not like an anti-racist organization. It's not like a Cop Watch, a Students Against Sweatshops. Although its members should, of course, be active in these kinds of groups. A cadre organization does not presume to be the leadership of these kinds of organizations. A cadre organization does not set out to create front groups. It doesn't set out to co-opt these organizations and use them for their own ends, although it certainly participates in these organizations and it struggles within them democratically, and, to be honest, it does provide leadership, oftentimes. But what a cadre organization tries to do is to participate. It's a collection of these active revolutionary intellectuals who seek to participate in these mass struggles, or at least potential mass struggles, that the cadre believes has the best chance to blow the lid off this society and create a free one. Now, so there's a definition of what a cadre organization is. Then I'll talk a little bit about the purpose. What is a cadre group for? What's it supposed to do? And simply, the purpose of a cadre group is to encourage the development of revolutionary struggle in the United States. That's the purpose of a cadre group. And the definition or purpose of a cadre group comes from numerous sources. I think Karl Marx in Communist Manifesto set up a very good definition of what the purpose of the Communist Party. And if we want to debate the differences between a party and cadre, I'm open to that later. But he says, look, the purpose of the Communist Party is not to lead the workers' struggle. It's to show the workers' struggle, the radical implications of their struggle. So the strike may be to limit the working day to 12 hours, but ultimately what you are struggling for, workers, is the abolition of work itself, or is the creation of a classless society. So the Communist Party seeks to show the radical nature of the struggle that the masses are organized involved in. And second of all, the purpose of a cadre group is to internationalize the struggle. It's to sweep away obstacles to unification of the working class. I think that's a reasonable definition of cadre group. It comes right out of the manifesto. Another good example of the definition of cadre group comes from C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. James argues, a great radical revolutionary intellectual in the 40s, 30s through the 80s. James argues that what a cadre group is supposed to do is, he says, to observe and record. Observe and record. In other words, a cadre group seeks to observe what the working class is doing on the ground and to record it. In that case, he meant a newspaper. But in some way to record it, to demonstrate, to give the workers a sense themselves of the revolutionary implications of what they're doing and the radical nature of their resistance to work, the resistance to the factory, resistance to the alienating society they live in. Now, I would add one other thing besides observe and record, in my understanding what the purpose of a cadre group is, and that is to participate. In other words, it's not enough to observe and record what's happening. One must participate in those struggles we think have the most revolutionary potential. And so a cadre group then it seeks to understand the world it lives in. It seeks to identify the forces that are struggling for a new world, or at least struggling in new and radical ways, and to try to develop those forces in a way that is consistent with the cadre's politics. Another thing I want to emphasize is that a cadre organization does not exist for the benefit of the revolution. In fact, cadre organizations typically fuck up a revolution when they get the chance. The purpose of a cadre, who needs a cadre organization? The revolutionaries need a cadre organization. The purpose of a cadre organization is to organize revolutionaries, not to organize the revolution. Not to organize the revolution. Its benefit to ordinary people in struggle is at best indirect, or at least up until the barricades go up and people are looking, saying, okay, we're destroying this world, what's the new one we're going to create? And then perhaps the cadre can come in and say, well, we have a few ideas here. But a revolutionary organization exists for the purpose of the revolutionaries, for intellectual clarity, development, and testing out of struggle. That's why we're in we create these kind of organizations, and why it's not a mass organization. It's not a very different kind of function. When we talk about the politics of a cadre group today, I'm obviously coming from a particular point, but I believe that the politics of a cadre group today, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, what a cadre group should fight for is really the fight for the expansion of democracy in all aspects of a human being's life. I mean, I don't need to tell to this group about the charade of liberal democracy when you get, 1 day out of 365 you get to vote, whereas 40 hours a week you live under a despotism. Right? So the politics of a cadre group is to expand democracy from 1 day in 365 to 24/7 365. And in this expansion of democracy it implies and requires a radical rejection of the state and a radical rejection of capitalism as two of the primary institutions that maintain the function of an alienated, unfree, miserable society. In other words, the state is not a path to the classless society. One of the lessons I have drawn, and I hope others have drawn, the state is not a path on the way to the classless society. It is an obstacle to the classless society, and it must be destroyed. Now, in this argument, I draw not just obviously from an anarchist tradition, but I think from a council communist, from a Jamesian tradition. I think there are many ways to arrive at this conclusion that don't have to be explicitly anarchist. The strategy. What is the strategy of a cadre organization? A cadre group seeks to develop a strategy that can best take advantage of a crisis in capitalism. One of my good comrades, she's a Star Wars fan, and so she says that let's just imagine that capitalism is the Death Star, and we are the rebels. And we are this is, of course, before the last three shitty Star Wars. So we are the rebels. We are hopelessly outgunned. We are hopelessly, infinitely weaker than. So how do you destroy the Death Star? Thank you. Use the Force. How do you destroy the Death Star?
Proton torpedo in the big shell.
You find the weak spot. Exactly. You find the weak spot. You don't just drop all your bombs on the surface and hope that they fall somewhere and the system will go in on itself. You find the crack in the concrete and you get your fingers there and you rip the fucker apart. That's what a cadre group seeks to try to do, is act like the Death Star and ask ourselves, what is capitalism's weakest point? And how can we attack it? How can we use our limited resources to find that crack in the concrete and to exploit it? And in particular, by exploiting it, what does it mean to find the crack in the concrete and to exploit it? It means we are trying to develop a dual power. And a quote from the Bring the Ruckus statement. By the way, I have copies of this, so if you're interested, feel free to just grab a copy. This is the organization I'm currently in. But as our initial statement for this Bring the Ruckus organization says, a dual power strategies are, quote, those forms of agitation that undermine the rule of official society and that in some way prefigure the new society, unquote. In other words, dual power is a situation in which two or more social forces are asserting power at the same time and for the same place and are capable of fighting for it. And obviously this kind of situation is going to be unstable. I think that the only kind of dual power I can think that's lasted in a kind of protracted sense would be the Zapatistas in Chiapas. But otherwise, a dual power situation is unstable. It leads to conflict. It turns into, ultimately, civil war. And civil war is, of course, our goal as revolutionaries. So, in order to build a dual power, a revolutionary organization must have a way to choose the kind of work that a cadre organization is going to participate in and to evaluate its effectiveness. In other words, what I'm saying is when we choose political work, we shouldn't choose political work. I mean, in some sense, it's okay to choose work that directly affects us most. But as revolutionaries, I think we have an additional responsibility to choose that kind of political work that we believe has the most revolutionary potential. And in defining what has the most revolutionary potential, we should ask ourselves, will it build a dual power? Now, so let me give you two examples. One in which kind of struggle I don't believe leads to a dual power, and one I think might. And I mean this as someone who's been a vegetarian for many years. I mean no harm. But I believe that even the most radical of animal rights organizations, such as the Animal Liberation Front, while I admire their bravery and courage and like quite a bit of what they do, that kind of activism, I would argue, has a very little chance of bringing about a situation of dual power in the United States. In other words, the struggle for a free society will not burst out of the struggle for animal liberation. And therefore, revolutionaries have an obligation, at least within a cadre organization, let me not speak for individuals, but a cadre organization should therefore carefully evaluate and say, you know, is animal liberation something we should really be putting our resources and our energy into? And I think the answer should be no, because it doesn't build a dual power. Or if someone thinks it does within the organization, they better bring an argument to explain how saving the puppies will lead to the classless society. And I'm willing to be corrected on that, but I don't think so. One example I think that might have dual power potential is in that when I was I participated in Minneapolis for a couple of years and then in Phoenix for about 5 or so, is an organization like Copwatch. And the reason why I believe Copwatch is an organization that has dual power is because when we are out on the street videotaping the police with our camera, we are preventing the police's ability to do their job. And by doing their job, I mean to enforce the color line, to treat certain people, members of the working class, one way and other members another way. And by preventing the police or inhibiting the police from doing their job, we not only disrupt the functioning of the powers that be in the society, we like to agree, or like to say, in some small way, prefigure a society that takes community self-defense on its own terms. In other words, we think that in some small way, the kernel of a new society is in the shell of the old, simply in a handful of skinny people videotaping the cops. In some way, the kernel of the new is in there. And that's the kind of, and we believe that given the right confluence of social forces and a good bit of luck, anti-police work has the potential to develop into the kind of wedge that could lead to a generalized riot in the terms of Los Angeles '92, something that could be perhaps sustained rather than eventually shut down. Now, is this a correct analysis? I don't know. I'm interested in hearing your take on it. This is something that we in Phoenix Cop Watch asked ourselves from the very day we began the project, and my comrades in Phoenix still ask to this day. And those other members of Ruckus who do Cop Watch ask it as well. But I think that's the purpose and the function of a cop group, is to choose our work strategically and then constantly asking ourselves, are we failing? And thinking of Marx's quote again, is that what we should be for is for a ruthless criticism of everything existing, and that's what we need to be involved in. So again, just to emphasize again, a cadres group, our role is not to start the revolution. We are not going to start the revolution. We're not going to lead the revolution. Thank God we're not going to lead the revolution. But even if its members never live to see a revolutionary situation, such as Love and Rage, even if its members labor in relative obscurity, such as a Sojourner Truth organization or a Fire by Night or a Storm, it can still play an indispensable role in preparing people for protracted struggle against the state. And to steal a metaphor, what I like to think is that the role of a cadre organization today is to be kind of like a crouching tiger that is laying in wait for a social crisis, for a depression, for a new civil rights movement to break out, something like that, that challenges the legitimacy and the stability of the state. And if and when that event occurs, the cadre organization that's been laying in wait, crouching, should be ready to pounce. And in some way try to affect the direction of that struggle and to internationalize it, to radicalize it, to borrow from Marx. So if that gives us a working definition of what a cadre organization is and its purpose and politics and strategy, what I take a cadre organization for the 21st century to be. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the organizations that I've been a part of. And the first one I'll talk about is Love and Rage. For those of you who don't know anything about Love and Rage, I recommend my comrade Roy Sanfilippo's collection, A New World in Our Hearts. Roy's a Ruckus member. He's got a very political interpretation of Love and Rage and what it did right, and explains the fall of Love and Rage. I, of course, think Roy is absolutely right, but I know other of my comrades, former comrades in Love and Rage, hate Roy for this argument. But it's a very useful argument and collection of text. Now, Love and Rage emerged in the context of a few things. It emerged in the context of a series of anarchist conferences that took place in North America from 86 to 89, Toronto, Chicago, and San Francisco. And San Francisco beat 89 being the main one. I got a tattoo of that one, so if anyone wants to see that. It emerged in the context of Central American solidarity movements taking place in the 80s. They were especially large in places like Minneapolis, where Love and Rage had a major local. It took place in the midst of a Nazi skinhead problem in the punk scene, and it took place, of course, in the midst of two major global events. First of all, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and secondly of all, the Gulf War, which mobilized and radicalized a good number of comrades of my generation. Now, Love and Rage started off as a network, whose purpose, and it started off actually at the 89 conference. The whole purpose was to produce a newspaper it was originally called Mayday. So that was the summer of 89. By 1991, it had become a network, kind of a loose, and it changed its name to Love and Rage, so it wasn't just a project to create newspaper, but to be a kind of a loose network. And then in 1993, it became a membership organization in San Diego, and it finally disbanded in 1998. And I joined Love and Rage in 1992. I became a serious member, say, in 93. I was an active member of the Minneapolis local until I moved away from Minneapolis in 96. And I was a member of the coordinating committee of the leadership body from 95 to 96. I edited the internal discussion bulletin, or as we call it, the Disco Bull, for a couple years after I moved to Phoenix. So that's kind of some of my role there. Now, I think Love and Rage introduced 4 innovations to the anarchist scene, and I think its impact at first, and probably still to this day, is mostly within that anarchist scene. But the 4 innovations I think Love and Rage introduced is, first of all, Love and Rage was an explicitly pro-organization position. Now, this may seem nuts to a bunch of Marxists in the room, and yes, it's the tragedy of the tradition from which I come, that you have to make an argument to fucking organize people and put them in it's a tragedy of my tradition. I accept the weight, the chain is around my ankle, it shall forever be there, and I ask forgiveness from those who have brighter ideas and infinite more wisdom. I have a few advantages, perhaps some of y'all don't, but that is my burden to bear. But it was definitely a pro-organization organization. We argue that anarchists must organize, and that it is not un-anarchist to do so. I like this crowd already because they're laughing. Well, I go to talk to a bunch of primitivists, and they're ready to, I don't know, throw their organic vegetables at me when I say It's so easy to pick on the primitivists, though. Animal rights and ELF, it's too easy. The other thing that we introduced, another innovation, was a critique of white supremacy, which again, this is the burden that folks like myself must bear, but within the white left, this is like, oh wow, white supremacy, huh? You know, a new thing for the white left, not a new thing for anyone else with their eyes open in the society in which we live in. But the critique of white supremacy and taking it seriously, making it a central part of our political work, this is another innovation that we developed, and another innovation from which we were attacked bitterly by the rest of the anarchist milieu. The third innovation was we developed an emerging analysis that I would say kind of paralleled the development of the analysis of what the Academy calls intersectionality. In other words, an argument, Love and Rage argued that any radical movement must fight all forms of oppression. And we took all forms of oppression seriously. And again, I think it's paralleling the rise of the notion of intersectionality taking place by particularly feminists of color like Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks in the mid-'90s as well. So we're paralleling that development in the Academy. And then finally, I think Love and Rage innovation was we had a commitment to being a fighting organization. In other words, an organization of activists, not scholars, who sought to directly confront the state. And I think this innovation dropped out of Love and Rage by the end, but I think a hint of a commitment to dual power strategies was there initially, and was always a wing within the organization trying to fight for these dual power strategies. So to talk about the strategy of Love and Rage, Love and Rage was a horrible organization to be a part of for at least the first, up until '95. It was a complete mess. I mean, the first national meeting I went to was in New York City. It was at this punk club called ABC No Rio. It was in the middle of January. It was probably 30 degrees. Inside, there was skinheads kissing each other in the back. There was like people not talking talking over each other. We didn't know how to talk politics. We didn't know how to have a decent political discussion. A bunch of, relatively intelligent 20-somethings couldn't fucking talk to each other. And so it was a mess. But we learned how to do it pretty quickly. And so by '95, we were a serious organization. And as a result of getting serious, we said we need to develop a strategy. And so in '95, we developed 3 political strategies and developed and created working groups to focus on these strategies. And these working groups at the time was an anti-fascist working group, a Mexico working group, and an anti-prison or a prison abolition working group. After about a year, now keep in mind '95, the Zapatista Revolution, or the Zapatista Uprising is January 1, 1994. For anyone who was an anarchist in January 1, 1994, this is about as close to heaven as I could have asked for politically, is to see a group of people rising up with principles that seem so clearly consistent with my anarchist politics. That in LA, April 30th, 1992 were like probably the 2 most significant moments in my life when I felt free, and I felt like I was in a world struggling for freedom. So we were strongly influenced by the Zapatistas. Some Love and Rage members actually went down and trained. One of our kind of half-assed, clandestine parts of Love and Rage is we sent some people down to train with the Zapatistas, which, if anyone knows, it's not that big a deal. They sent lots of people went down and trained with the Zapatistas. But in any case, we had that working group. But eventually, the enthusiasm for the Mexico working group faded, and we replaced that working group because people had stopped doing Zapatista solidarity work, and it replaced it with something called the anti-austerity working group. And if it sounds bloated and convoluted, it's because it was, and didn't do anything. And each working group was expected to do work in mass struggle. So, for example, the anti-fascist working group, the main focus of the anti-fascist working group was to focus on an organization called Anti-Racist Action, which I reckon many of you are familiar with. And so ARA's functioned as a mass organization, and it was actually quite a large organization in the mid-'90s, and it had some potential, I think. It was composed of a network of locals, ARA was, each working independently where they shared a bare minimum of 4 principles of unity. I think most of the ARA did, and as do now, just spent their time chasing Nazis around, which is not a revolutionary strategy in my mind. But it did have some other elements in the organization that I thought had some potential. But what Love and Rage, we saw ourselves, our role as a cadre organization was to participate in ARA, or at least certain members of us, and to try to lead ARA in radical directions. And we did this work fully, we did this work sincerely, we didn't assume leadership unless we had earned it, we didn't seek to run ARA as a front group or anything like this. So I think we demonstrated to ourselves to satisfaction, if not any other anarchists, that it is possible for a cadre organization to do mass work organized in a principled democratic fashion that doesn't seek to be a front group or anything like that. However, I think to criticize our strategy in Love and Rage is that our political work was supposedly based on strategy. In other words, where are the cracks in the concrete? But actually, our political work was almost entirely chosen by that was the work that our members were already doing. They were already doing Zapatista work. They were already in anarchist black crosses. They were already in anti-racist action. So we said, hey, now we've got a strategy. Let's do these three things. That was not a strategy. And those who did attempt to argue for strategy, such as myself, who argued for a focus on the cops, it was not taken seriously. In fact, my proposal failed once. I pissed and moaned about a procedural issue. It came in and it passed the second time, and it never went anywhere because there's no enthusiasm for the group. In other words, no one in Love and Rage shifted their political work to something else for strategic reasons. I think that was a mistake. I think that was a problem. The politics of Love and Rage. Love and Rage was clearly seen as a pole within the anarchist milieu. The main magazines there was, Anarchy Magazine, Alternative Press Review, Fifth Estate, stuff like that. We were a pole within that milieu. We were a hated pole. They hated our fucking guts. I remember I went to one of those, useless anarchist conferences in Wisconsin in '92, where the only thing is the beer is cheap and you meet lots of nice friends. That's always what people say. I met a lot of nice people. Did you do any work? No. I met a lot of nice people. Right. Well, I meet a lot of nice people when I go to heavy metal shows, but I don't call that politics. But more nice people at a Motorhead gig than at an anarchist conference, probably. But in any case, now I've got Ace of Spades in my head. I've lost my mind. Yes. So I was at a Wisconsin anarchist conference, and one of the informal leaders of Love and Rage is a guy named Chris Day, who some of y'all might be familiar. And so we were at this conference, and Chris is at this conference, and Chris sees an old guy from the left that he knew, and so he goes up and says, "Hey, so-and-so," and the guy wouldn't shake his hand. He just kept saying, "Fuck you, Trotsky. Fuck you, Trotsky. Fuck you, Trotsky." And he was a Trotskyist. We were Trotskyists or Leninists or Maoists or, I don't know, the devil incarnate within this anarchist milieu because we dared to say anarchists should be organized. So we were hated, and I'm still surprised when I hear people talk about Love and Rage fondly today. Like when I go on the web, occasionally I go to an anarchist website and they're like, "Yeah, well, Love and Rage did this," and I'm like, "You mean?" And then where is it that we are the Antichrist? And that line is not in the meme. I'm still shocked when people speak of Love and Rage fondly because we were hated back in the day. And Chris, you could probably attest, you could confirm from as an outside source that we were not loved. I don't know where you were on the love or hate Love and Rage, but we can fight that over later, I suppose. But we generally, so we were a pole within the anarchist milieu. We were a hated pole within the milieu. It eventually became a badge of honor, somewhat. And we generally held politics along the lines of the four innovations I mentioned. The intersectionality, the critique of white supremacy, being pro-organization, and being a fighting organization. Those were generally our politics. We spent a great deal of time trying to write a political statement, and we sucked way too much time out of our national conferences, spending full days. When you only get 2-3 days to meet with your comrades in once a year, to spend all that time writing a document was a complete waste of time. But we really thought that writing a political statement was necessary to be have fully coherent politics. That was a mistake. And we never finished it. So to say that we had a fully articulated sense of politics would be incorrect, and not because we didn't write a political statement, but probably because we believe that developing fully articulated politics meant having a political statement. I mean, I think you got to say somewhat what you all believe, but good Lord, every jot and tittle doesn't need to be debated about. So then what happened in about '97? I'm probably going to get the dates wrong. Is that Chris Day wrote an article within our internal discussion bulletin, later reprinted in one of the Love and Rages, and the title in the internal discussion bulletin was called "The Historical Failure of Anarchism." And essentially what it was a critique of the anarchist politics within the Spanish Civil War. Now, for those of you who know the Spanish Civil War, you know that that is it for an anarchist politics. That was the time when the anarchists were doing it, right? And we were doing it right. Well, Chris says, no, the anarchists were doing it wrong. And I think Chris was correct in his analysis. His analysis was a radical, independent analysis. It wasn't like a pro-POOM or a pro-PGP or PCP or anything like that. It was a fair, accurate, healthy critique of the role of the anarchists in the Spanish Revolution, and then drawing the implications of that for anarchist politics today. Well, the response was, by some folks, an appreciation, like that was useful, appreciate it. And others, it wasn't a response, it was seen as an attack on the anarchist integrity of Love and Rage. And these folks wrote a document called What We Believe, which is in both Chris's article and What We Believe is in Roy's book. And What We Believe statement essentially asserted this kind of dogmatic anarchist philosophy and said anyone who doesn't believe this should be run out on a rail. And they had some very specific people they wanted run out on a rail. And so what this led to is within the locals in New York and Michigan, we had a strong local in New York City, and we had a good set of locals in Detroit and Lansing. It led to a rift within those two organizations, those two locals, between the pure anarchists who charged that others were bringing a creeping Leninism and Maoism to the group, and that led to the split within. It ultimately is given credit for leading to the split within the organization itself. I think that's slightly exaggerated. I think it led to the split within New York and Michigan, but not the other two places where we had locals, which is one was Mexico City and the other was Minneapolis. So I'll talk about those in a second. Well, Mexico City, frankly, I don't have a. Seemed to me it fell apart as best I could get was from internal conflicts among the comrades, and so I don't have a very good political critique of why Amor y Rabia, our Mexican branch, fell apart. But I do have I think an analysis of Minneapolis, because so if the reason for the collapse of Love and Rage in Michigan and New York City was the politics of Love and Rage, I think the reason for the collapse of Love and Rage in Minneapolis, the other main local in the U.S. anyway, was a sense of purpose. In other words, people didn't understand in Minneapolis what the hell a cadre organization was for. And it didn't, to many of them. Not everyone had a sense of what the purpose of Love and Rage was, how we related to mass organization work, how we were different from that kind of work, and how Love and Rage related or contributed to the organizing they were already doing on the ground. And I think that's a legitimate question. In what way, if an organization is not speaking to the political work you're doing on the ground or that you've chosen to do, then yeah, it's a fair question whether this is a useful group. Well, what happens is about 3 key members in Minneapolis left the local at about the same time, and the group just kind of frittered away and didn't even play any part in the debates over what we believe statement. And so I think it wasn't politics that did in Minneapolis. It was a sense among many of the Minneapolis locals that we didn't really know what the purpose of Love and Rage was. Now, what happens then is Love and Rage dissolves in May of '98 in New York, somewhat amicably, somewhat not. I saved my money and didn't spend a plane ticket to go out to see my beloved organization go to shit, so I wasn't there. But what ends up happening is almost immediately, one wing, the wing who was anti-what we believe, started a new organization called Fire by Night. And I was not a member of Fire by Night. Fire by Night recruited me. They sent me a couple internal discussion bulletins. I did not join for reasons I can talk about in a second. But so my knowledge of Fire by Night is going to be short here and open to correction. But from my understanding, what happened to Fire by Night is that it formed in '98, almost immediately after the breakup of Love and Rage, and it had 2 main locals, one here in the Bay Area and the other in New York City. And I believe it dissolved in early 2001. Is this correct? Yes. Okay. Now I'll just talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of Fire by Night from an outside perspective. Again, from the perspective of someone many of whom were my dear friends, and also and former comrades, and also from someone who got to read a couple of their internal discussion bulletins and stuff like that. Is what Fire by Night tried to do, from my understanding, is to take the best of Love and Rage and to improve on it and to become a really serious cadre organization. And anyone who's familiar with Love and Rage at the time knows it had a lot of work to do to get serious. And Fire by Night took that task seriously and really tried to make it a serious, tight political organization. It particularly took political education of its members seriously. It took security very seriously, and it took the need to develop a political analysis very seriously, from my understanding. Now, these seem to me to be the strengths of Fire by Night. The weaknesses is that I think it took Love and Rage's weaknesses and in trying to turn them into strengths, in some ways turn them into fetishes. In other words, for example, the intellectual development. Again, I'm an outsider. One member of Ruckus is in Fire by Night. He's told me some stuff too, but this is an outsider's perspective. But it seemed to me that in terms of intellectual development, the requirements to join Fire by Night were extremely arduous, almost to the point of being ridiculous, I think. The political study they engaged in was very arduous too, in terms of all weekend long study sessions, which I don't have such a problem with, but it seemed like it was very difficult for them to draw new members in because of the arduous commitment to intellectual development, which seemed to border on a fetish at sometimes. Also security, it seemed to me that they took security to some absurd levels too. Some of the things I read in the internal bulletin was requiring members to carry a pen and paper with them at all times to note security threats, and then immediately mail these off to the security committee. Or another suggestion from the security committee, if I remember it right, was to require all members to keep their apartments clean in case they get raided by the feds. That way they can know their apartment's been raided by the feds. And now this tells us two things. One, it tells us that most people in the organization are 20-something slobs who need to be told to keep their apartments clean. So that tells us a little bit about the demographic of the organization, which is coming out of Love Rage, which is the exact same demographic. Not surprising, but it also I think tells a little bit about taking something serious, the need to improve on security, taking it a little. Turning into a fetish, right? Turning into a little bit stronger than we need to be. Third, and maybe this is a little more substantive, is I think that the analysis, Fire by Night also took race very seriously, had an analysis of it and made it central to their politics. But I think their analysis of race was actually weak and watered down from Love and Rage. Following Chris Day's lead, Chris Day was one of the main persons who moved from Love and Rage to help form Fire by Night, one of the founders. He, at about the time that he was writing the Critiques of Anarchism, he was also coming to an analysis of race that really sees race more in terms of a form of national oppression rather than racial oppression. And I don't have any problem, I don't want to challenge anyone's desire to define themselves as a nation in this room or anywhere in society, but I think that the way that race functions in the United States is different from forms of national oppression or colonial oppression. I think there's some important distinctions that Day had pretty much not accepted anymore. And so he had changed his analysis, and it seemed to me that Fire by Night had changed their analysis in ways that I think were ultimately did them in. And I'll give two examples, one of which is something I read in the bulletin, and I never got another bulletin after, so there might have been a very vigorous critique of this, and that would be, so then I would have to take back this critique. But one time, one of the members in Oakland, as far as I understand, were doing work organizing tenants communities or organizing housing developments. Michelle, can you back me up on this? Mm-hmm. And one of the reports, very useful, interesting report on their work, was that they encountered the housing consisted of two main groups. One was African Americans, and one was Chinese residents. And they had a problem, what the author called the pee-pee on the stairs problem. And the pee-pee on the stairs problem, the author said, was that what was happening was that the Chinese residents were complaining that the black residents were sloppy, were pigs, were disgusting, were not clean. Now, anyone who has just a bit of analysis of race in this society, the code word should come up when talking about black people being dirty. That this is a code for an attempt to, to my analysis, to some way assert the Chinese immigrants asserting their sense of belonging to this country by leapfrogging over African Americans. In other words, the way in which the Irish, the Jews, the Greeks, the Italians, every other practically immigrant group has tried to succeed in society is by leapfrogging over black folk. And to me, when I saw this pee-pee on the stairs problem, it seemed to me like this is the problem, and that what the Fire by Night needs to do is to fight this developing racist politics within some members of the Chinese community members to say this pee-pee on the problem is stairs problem. This is the problem we need to focus on in order for the class struggle to continue. Instead, what the report said is that we are trying to avoid the pee-pee on the stairs problem as much as possible. Now, again, I'm willing to be corrected on the facts and the details, but this is one, I thought, one negative effect of the changing analysis of race that Fire by Night had from Love and Rage. And I think, and I've heard the full story, and I've forgotten most of it, but it ultimately attacks or criticisms of racial chauvinism regarding the New York locals work within the Student Liberation Action Movement, SLAM, at CUNY, City University of New York, is what basically did in the New York locals, and ultimately the entire Fire by Night organization. So while some folks were moving off, what we believe, folks, I don't have much sympathy for. I think they're politically irrelevant. I think they proved their political irrelevance by they pretended they were going to start a journal. They never even put out issue number 1. They fought for the right to keep the name Love and Rage. Oh no, excuse me. Love and Rage had a 501c3. We had nonprofit status because we had a couple of very generous donors who were donating large amounts of money to Love and Rage. We had a newspaper. Anyone wants to start a newspaper in this room as a cadre organization? Talk to me afterwards, and I will do everything in my power to talk you out of that project because it was a black hole of money that made life difficult for us. But in any case, those who were very generous wanted their money to be tax deductible, so they created a 501c3 called the Aspect Foundation. And the one part of the agreement was that the What We Believe folks got the Aspect Foundation. And what happens, these folks were so disorganized that Chris Day, being the sneaky little devil he was, made a little call to the person who actually had the Aspect Foundation in her name. She wasn't political anymore, and said, do you still have that Aspect Foundation? She's like, yeah. And he waited a few months. He was principled about it, right? And then he called, can I have it now? And she's like, oh, sure, I don't want it anymore. So so in effect, Fire by Night came in and took the 501c3 status. And fair play as far as I'm concerned. What We Believe folks had demonstrated their political... I'm sorry?
And all the
yes,
debt.
well, Fire by Night, to their credit, Fire by Night assumed the debt before you all had 501c3 status. So it was, you deserve by right the 501c3 from my clear perspective. But it was perfectly fair game, and it just represents the irrelevance of that What We Believe dogmatic kind of anarchist with a capital A politics. So there's that path went quickly into irrelevance. The Fire by Night folks went their direction, and then the direction I went was toward an organization, or toward, I guess more specifically, a journal that was called Race Trader. And for those of you who don't know anything about Race Trader is a radical journal that began publishing in 1992. It was started by a guy named Noel Ignatieff and John Garvey, and later, a little bit later, Beth Henson became the third main editor. Both Noel and Beth were members of the Sojourner Truth organization, which is another extremely significant cadre organization that came out of the splits in SDS, and it was active from early 70 all the way up till 82. STO is something, if I could speak on with some knowledge today, I would. It's, to my mind, probably the best, perhaps the best of the cadre organizations that I'll talk about, with the exception of Bring the Ruckus, of course. But in any case, these were former members of the Sojourner Truth. John Garvey was closely associated with it. He was in a radical taxi drivers organization in New York, but he was associated. And Sojourner Truth's politics were greatly influenced by the Revolutionary SEAL Art James. Now, so the journal starts in 92 and 1997. In other words, just at about the time that Love and Rage is engaging in the debates that's going to lead to the organization's demise, the editors of Race Trader launched an organization they called the New Abolitionist Society. And the purpose of the New Abolitionist Society was to be a non-racial organization devoted to the abolition of the white race. In other words, which is fancy, clever language for the abolition of white supremacy and all forms of white privilege. They held this conference in Manhattan in 1997. And what they tried to do is they tried to build what Race Trader editors would call not so much a multiracial, but a non-racial political tendency. We can talk about the distinctions later if you like, along the lines of the Race Trader politics. They held this conference in Manhattan in 97. They organized a nationwide celebration of John Brown's birthday in 2000. And they published a newsletter for several years. I was one of the co-editors of the newsletter. We had a presence on the internet and print. And it also held regular weekend-long meetings. We met about 2 to 3 times a year, and it was a loose organization, so it wasn't like a membership organization, and who attended kind of rotated in and out, but steady people would be Garvey, Ignatieff, Henson, myself, a guy named Chris Niles, and some other folks. We met 2 to 3 times a year for a weekend. It frankly was some of the most invigorating, inspiring, important political discussion I've ever had. But the organization, the attempt to create a mass organization out of this journal, never got off the ground. The newsletter, we stopped publishing it in 2000, frankly, because we weren't getting enough responses. We weren't pissing enough people off or attracting enough people to justify it. Stopped publishing it in 2000. I became close to Ignatieff. Ignatieff joined Love and Rage briefly in 1994. I became close to him after he joined. I was a member of the New Abolition Society to the extent that it was a membership group. I co-edited the newsletter and the website, and I've attended all of their meetings. We've met less frequently throughout the years, but we have kept meeting. The last meeting we had was last July. Now, talk a little bit about the politics and strategy of race trader in some detail, because Ruckus's politics and strategy are influenced by the race trader. What race trader argues is that the key to revolutionary change in the United States is through the destruction of white supremacy, or what it calls the abolition of the white race. It urges whites to become what it calls race traders. In other words, people who actively seek to reject their racial privileges and side with the struggles of people of color for a free world. And hence their slogan was, "Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." This is the Journal of Race Traders. The New Abolitionist Society did not have that slogan because it was not an all-white organization, nor was it intended to be. Now, their initial editorial, a quote from that, which they repeated in all issues, declares, quote, "The white race is a historically constructed social formation. It consists of all those who partake of the privileges of the white skin in the society. Its most wretched members share a status higher, in certain respects, than that of the most exalted persons excluded from it, in return for which they give their support to a system that degrades them. The key to solving the social problems of our age is to abolish the white race, which means no more and no less than abolishing the privileges of the white skin. Until that task is accomplished, even partial reform will prove elusive, because white influence permeates every issue, domestic and foreign, in U.S. society." Now, the essence of race trader's strategy then lies in its analysis of the centrality of white supremacy to the functioning of capitalism in the United States. And what race trader argues is that since race has no biological essence, well, what the hell does it mean to be white then? And what race trader argues is that really what white means is whiteness is a cross-class alliance. In other words, it's an alliance between the ruling class and one section of the working class. And this group gets called white. And the rest of the working class gets called not white, or the archetype for which has been blacklisted. So this cross-class alliance, working class members of this alliance, agree to ensure the relatively smooth accumulation of capital, and in exchange for which they are granted relatively minor privileges, what W.E.B. Du Bois calls public and psychological wages of whiteness, ranging from the right to vote, to the right to possess arms, to the right to participate in a free and unrestricted market, back, say, pre-1965, to the right to decent treatment by the cops today, constitute an example of these wage inequalities. And the hallmark of the system is that all whites, whether you're rich or poor, enjoy a social status that is in some way superior to the most well-off, well-educated, esteemed person who's not white in this society. So when Danny Glover complains that he can't catch a cab in New York City, even though he's a multi-millionaire, this is and then some idiot like myself stumbling out of a bar on the Lower East Side can get one like that. This is an example that in some way I enjoy a status superior to even that of a Danny Glover in this society. And this, by the way, is one of the distinctions that I think Chris Day dropped this analysis of race when he created Fire by Night, and one reason why I disagree with what Chris was wrong, because I think this is essentially the correct analysis of how the white race functions in the United States. And so what race trader argues is that a collective assault on this cross-class line, not merely individuals saying, "Oh, I'm not white anymore." That's kind of the rep race trader got, and it was an incorrect reputation, I believe. That race trader always argued that it's a collective assault on the cross-class lines. That is the weak spot in capitalism. That's where the weakness of the Death Star lies. And so if you focus your energies on attacking white supremacy, on abolishing these racial privileges, then it's not that the new society magically appears, but that space is created for struggles for a totally free society. And the historical evidence behind that is the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil War starts off as a war against slavery, and what it ends up doing is it ends up creating probably the most radical government human beings have ever known in Western civilization, that of the South Carolina Commune of 1860, 1874, in which a majority of ex-slaves, ran South Carolina for 6 years and created, again, some of the most radical, far-reaching objectives that put shame to the Paris Commune and that dwarfs the accomplishments of the Spanish anarchists, and that no one in this society even reads, and to my understanding, hardly anyone on the left even studies the free society that was created for those brief 3 years in South Carolina. So, in other words, what starts off as a generalized struggle against white supremacy leads to the creation of a commune, essentially, leads to the expansion of the feminist struggle. It leads to fight for an 8-hour working day, In other words, it leads to radical possibilities. Same with the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement starts off again attacking the color line, attacking the wages of whiteness, and what it does is it gives birth to the second wave of the feminist movement. It gives birth to brown power. It gives birth to black power. It gives birth to the student movement, to the anti-war movement. It gives birth to Stonewall. In other words, all these. The civil rights movement didn't immediately create the revolution, but it cleared political space for all these other kinds of struggles to take place. And based on that history, Ray Schrader argued that attacking whiteness is, when you attack whiteness, the pillars of this society tremble and more radical forms of change become possible. Yes?
Where in South Carolina was it, and what was the name of it?
This is the entire state of South Carolina in 1868. After the result of the 14th Amendment, black folks were enfranchised. And, of course, you've got a military dictatorship in the South. And what you end up with is the group that wrote the new Constitution, the post-slavery Constitution, was a majority black state legislature. Of those, about 75 of the 125 were black. Of those 75, about 50 to 60 were former slaves. Of those 75, of the full 125, about a third of them were illiterate. So I ask you, can you imagine a more proletarian composition of any organization, way more proletarian than the Paris Commune, that gets all the credit, and that did not nearly enough. If anyone's interested, the text on that is W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, which I would urge all revolutionaries in the United States to read and to study. It's one of the most fundamental texts for me to understand how this society functions. But he has a chapter on North Carolina, which he proposed to call the dictatorship of the proletariat in South Carolina, and was talked out of it by some of his idiot white lefty friends. But nevertheless, his politics are there. So, now, these are the politics of Ray Schrader. We'll talk a little bit about the limits of Ray Schrader. And I think Ray Schrader had two limits. Some of the limits is that one limit that I don't take quite as seriously is that they said that Ray Schrader was written by and for white people. Well, that may be true for the journal's audience was white, but the organization was not. And the organization did not have this politics that some accuse it of just saying individuals can say, I'm not white anymore, and act accordingly. Ray Schrader they celebrated individual instances of race treason, but they never pretended that white people could jump out of their whiteness, and they recognized that it was always involved a collective struggle. So that's a clarification. But the criticism of Ray Schrader is that no concrete struggles or organizations came out of it. The members the founders were fully convinced when they started this journal that a new political tendency would emerge out of it, and it never happened. Now I think this is part due to the editors' uneven attempts and inabilities to create an organization. I don't think they had the patience to build a new organization, frankly, and it showed. But I think clearly the politics of Ray Schrader didn't tap as deeply into a constituency as they hoped. And perhaps the only organization that really emerged out of Ray Schrader was Bring the Ruckus itself. And if anyone has seen the document that's being passed around, you'll see our influence, Ray Schrader's influence. But I think it's fair to say that Garvey and Ignatieff, especially, and Henson less so, think that even Bring the Ruckus is not the kind of organization they had envisioned. The second criticism of Ray Schrader is that this is a criticism that Ray Schrader itself had come to, that we had come to several years ago, is that perhaps in this position in which the state is no longer directly enforcing de jure legal forms of discrimination, perhaps a politics to abolish white privilege is necessary but no longer sufficient to bring about revolution in the United States. That is, it's absolutely necessary. Anyone here who's involved with the racism of the anti-globalization movement knows what I'm talking about. It's absolutely necessary for any social movement to confront the wages of whiteness directly if it wants to have any hope to transform society. But at the same time, maybe a challenge to institutionalize to de facto and to de jure, overt and covert forms of white privilege no longer has the potential to rock society to the core, like it has, from the invention of the white race and the first slave rebellions in say, the early 18th century and late 17th century up till 65. Maybe we have to admit that condition doesn't exist anymore. So if this is the case, then a new revolutionary organization, this is my conclusion anyway, that a new revolutionary organization must put the attack of white supremacy at the center of its analysis and at the center of its political work, but in a way that recognizes that it's necessary but perhaps not sufficient, and that can, in other words, that can still develop an effective revolutionary praxis for this new century and the new material conditions we face. And this is the work that Ruckus, Bring the Ruckus, is engaged in, that I'll talk about next. And in doing this work, our forum said, Ruckus, we owe a debt to Love and Rage, we owe a debt to Race Trader, we owe a debt to the black radical tradition from Nat Turner to Du Bois to C.L.R. James to Ella Baker to Malcolm X. This is the tradition in which we identify, successfully or not, and these are the influences. Now, Ruckus begins as a small local organization in Phoenix in 1997, started by myself and a handful of other folks. Our first project was to start up a cop watch in Phoenix, which hit the streets in February of '99 and is still patrolling today. But after that, after the cop watch was up and rolling, we participated in it, but we didn't lead it. It became an autonomous organization. And then we were trying to figure out what the hell we would do next as a project. Of course, we're committed to intellectual development of ourselves and everything else, but we wanted to do some politics. And then Seattle '99 takes place, and it shocked us. I knew, the organizing for Seattle had taken place a long time, and I was kind of like, yeah, whatever, we'll see what the anarchists can do. And bless their hearts, they fucked shit up. And so we were impressed, and we saw this growing anti-globalization movement. We were impressed by it. At the same time, we had some criticisms of it, especially around the wages of whiteness that were being cashed in throughout that movement. And we thought to ourselves, what this movement needs is it needs a cadre organization. In other words, it needs a group of disciplined revolutionaries committed to doing the work within it, but also fighting to internationalize the movement, to radicalize the movement. And without it, we feared that the anti-globalization movement would peter out. And I think so far history is bearing us out. So as a result of that, we decided to try to Bring the Ruckus into a national organization. And what we wrote is this statement that I've handed out here in April of 2001, and by November of 2002 we had our first meeting, and our first founding meeting was in Portland, in Los Angeles of last year, and our next national meeting is in May in Portland. And what I'm going to argue here, how much time do I have before I should shut up?
20 minutes.
Oh shit, I got a lot of time. All right, good. What I'm going to argue in a obviously biased and deliberately polemical manner, in order to encourage debate, is that what Ruckus tries to do is it tries to bring together the best aspects of Sojourner Truth, of Love and Rage, of Fire by Night, of Race Trader, and of the black radical tradition in this country, in order to build an effective cadre organization for the 21st century. And in building an effective cadre organization, we seek to develop a strong analysis of how the society functions, where its weak spots are, to encourage the intellectual development of our membership, and to facilitate a deep engagement with on-the-ground political struggles. We are agitators, not just book readers. And so in Ruckus, we constantly ask ourselves, within the locals, within our national meetings, within our discussion bulletins, what is the weakest point in capitalism and how can we attack it? And the answer, again, in other words, how can we use our limited resources to get our fingers in the cracks in the concrete? And our strategy to this day is still focused on building a dual power by breaking apart this cross-class alliance that constitutes the essence of whiteness in this society, or whatever you want to call the white community. James Baldwin's convinced me that there's no such thing as a white community. In other words, we see our main goal is to undermine these wages of whiteness that it grants the white working class so that the white working class can recognize its revolutionary potential and join the rest of the world in struggling for a free society. And this is from the Ruckus statement. It says, the proposed organization's priority should be to destroy white supremacy. White supremacy is a system that grants those defined as white special privileges in American society, such as preferred access to the best schools, neighborhoods, jobs, and health care, greater advantages in accumulating wealth, a lesser likelihood of imprisonment, and better treatment by the police and the criminal justice system. In exchange for these privileges, whites agreed to police the rest of the population through such means as slavery, segregation in the past, and through formerly colorblind policies and practices today that still serve to maintain white privilege. White supremacy, then, unites one section of the working class with the ruling class against the rest of the working class. And this cross-class alliance represents the principal obstacle, strategically speaking, to revolution in the United States. The central task of the new organization should be to break up this unholy alliance between the ruling class and the white working class by attacking the system of white privilege and the subordination of people of color. This is not to say that white supremacy is the worst form of oppression in the country, nor is it to imply that if white supremacy disappears, then all other forms of oppression will magically melt away, as some socialists like to do back in the day, that abolishing capitalism and every other problem will take care of itself. Instead, it is a strategic argument based on an analysis of American history designed to attack the American Death Star at its weakest point. The glue that has kept the American state together has been white supremacy. Melting that glue creates revolutionary possibilities. Now, when we talk about glue and strategy, I think I just want to emphasize that the glue that keeps a society together is different in different nation states. I don't believe it's white supremacy in every state. Perhaps it's the status of Kurds in Turkey that keeps the Turkish capital together. Perhaps it is the status of Palestinians in Israel that keeps the Israeli state together. Perhaps it's the status of women in Saudi Arabia that keeps the Saudi state together. It's probably social democracy, the welfare state, that keeps the working class from being revolutionary in Europe, etc. So the glue can be different in different societies. In the U.S., that glue is whiteness. So as a result of that analysis, we developed a strategy. In other words, a strategy of what kind of work we are going to do. We are going to provide, as an organization, we are going to focus on, and we're going to devote our resources to our limited resources. In choosing that work, we said we need some criteria to help us choose what work we're going to do. And in that, we developed, at our first meeting in Phoenix in 2002, we developed what we call the 6 criteria. And the 6 criteria is that in choosing our political work, that work must meet the 6 criteria. The 6 criteria is this. First of all, the work must attack white supremacy. Second of all, it must address systems that attack working class people of color. These are obviously overlapping, but I think they're distinct enough to list as 2 points. Third, it must have the potential to further the development of revolutionary consciousness among the working class. Fourth, it must have the potential to build a dual power. In other words, it must challenge state power or prefigure a challenge to state power. It must pose a revolutionary or potentially revolutionary challenge to that power, and it must prefigure a new society in some way. Number 5, it must be consistent with a feminist praxis. And 6, it should stretch the boundaries of political organization. In other words, we want to encourage creativity, not doing the same shit over and over again, because the same shit has failed over and over again. Now, as a result of that 6 criteria, the 2 strategic things we decided to focus on are the prisons and the police. And our anti-police work is generally focused on cop watch. We're active in cop watches in Portland, in Phoenix are the main ones. We also, our anti-prison work is focused on 2 things. One is we're participating in critical resistance in New York and Los Angeles in particular. And the other anti-prison work is the grassroots prison campaign in Georgia, led by one of our most dynamic agitators, Dan Horowitz de Garcia. And Dan's project is there are 500,000 people. 500,000 people in the state of Georgia who are in some ways connected to the criminal justice system. In other words, they are either an ex-convict themselves, or they have a friend, or they have a family member who is an ex-convict. Right, 500,000 people. And so the Grassroots Prisons Campaign Project goal is to organize 1% of that 500,000 people in order to, what makes that 30, 40 people? 5,000, right? Yeah. 5,000 G. To organize 5,000 people, we've had our first organizing blitz in February. It was very successful, and we're having another one in the summer. And if people are interested in going down to Atlanta and doing some work and meeting Dan, who's again one of the most dynamic people I've ever met, if you want to do that kind of work, you can talk to me. You don't have to be a Ruckus member in order to do this work. I'm happy to hook you up. We've also had some exploratory work, in other words, areas of work that we do not donate our resources to. We don't devote our resources to. Our resources go to these 2 things. But this work includes workplace organizing and anti-recruitment work. Upcoming stuff, our upcoming meeting is in May in Portland. Look for a debate to focus our political energies on organizing the South. We've got a proposal already on the table that the South, if revolution is going to break out in the United States, it's probably going to break out where it's broke out before, in other words, in the South. Fort Sumter, Greensboro, Atlanta, etc. So look for that. Look for a further debate on the function of race in society. Look for a further discussion on developing an international analysis. Now, some of the things about Love and Rage, or excuse me, about Ruckus, that is an advantage from my participation in Love and Rage, is that members in Ruckus, I think, have a much better sense of the purpose of what a cadre organization is in Love and Rage. And this is partly due to the very unusual way in which Love and Rage was created. Love and Rage, Chris Day is really the intellectual leader of Love and Rage, and Chris Day had a plan. Chris Day had a plan from 1989 that what was needed was a cadre organization in the United of anarchists, but that anarchists weren't ready for it. And so what they needed to do is we needed to go incrementally, step by step, start with a newspaper project, then a network, then a federation. And he was successful in doing that. But in the process of this of this plan, which not everyone was given privy to, outside of the mind of Chris Day, was that is that a lot of people didn't understand what the function of a cadre organization. They were kind of pulled in by the dynamic people in the organization, etc. Still don't understand what the hell the purpose is. I think Ruckus members have a much better sense of our role is not to lead the revolution, but to bring out the revolutionary tendencies that already exist in this society. This is from the Ruckus statement. Revolutionary organization, quote, does not seek to control any organization or movement, nor does it pretend that it is the most advanced section of a struggle and thus has the right to act in the interests of the masses. Instead, it assumes that the masses are typically the most advanced section of a struggle and that the cadre perpetually strives to learn from and identify with the masses. At the same time, a cadre organization doesn't pretend it doesn't provide leadership for larger movements, nor does it pretend that leadership is inherently authoritarian. Here again is a nod to the anarchist ball and chain that many of us have. A cadre organization does not seek to control any organization or movement. It aims to help lead it by providing with a radical perspective and committed members dedicated to develop its autonomous revolutionary potential. A little bit about the structure. I hope it's obvious to most people in this room that by now that the vanguard structure of leading a revolution has been a failure. And that those states organized that define themselves as Marxists have failed to deliver. That is, whatever iron rice bowl they've brought about, whatever changes, however cool Cuba is, it is not free. And the people who live in these societies are not free. In other words, so communism has failed, the vanguard party has failed to deliver the goods. And so we need to acknowledge that the vanguard party has failed and reject it. And no group of revolutionaries should set themselves up as the vanguard leadership for the people in the sense that they can act on behalf of the masses rather than let them encouraging the autonomous development of the masses of ordinary people themselves. But at the same time, our conclusion was that the anarchist model of organization was also a failure. Keep in mind that the anarchist model of organization is not Love and Rage, it's the network. It's the network. The network, a loose group of organizations roughly around some kind of vague principles of unity. And this is the model that the anti-globalization movement follows, and the anti-war, to the extent that it exists, that model they follow. And this anarchist model is also insufficient and should not be adopted, at least by a cadre organization. I think it works for some mass organizations, but not for a cadre. Because for one, the anarchist network model, A, it has difficulty creating political unity and principles. B, it has difficulty making decisions. C, even worse, it has even more trouble carrying the decisions out. Anyone in this room who's been to an anarchist conference has torn their hair out at the making of a decision and then felt beat down and defeated after the decision rather than invigorated, and then just a sense of burnout when a year later not one thing has been done that was agreed on, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And the problem with the anarchist network model is that despite its anti-authoritarianism, it has a tendency to create de facto but unaccountable leadership. Anarchist networks always have leaders. It's just the anarchists deny that they exist. And so what that does is just keeps perpetuating those leaders' undue influence. And in fact, it's those people who are the leadership most strongly argue that there is no leadership in the organization. When anyone tells you that there's no leaders in the organization, keep an eye on that person because she's a leader. Well, it's usually he, but... Now, so as a result, what Ruckus has is we have a membership model of organization. In other words, if you are to be a member of Ruckus, you have to make a political and a financial commitment to the organization. A political commitment simply means a general agreement with the principles and the politics of the organization, and a commitment to struggling to advance those politics. And a financial commitment right now is defined as 1 day's wages, in which you get to define how much you earn, but 1 day's wages is the cost of being a member. So what our membership model does is what we seek to do is we try to allow for full and free debate, but also accountability at the same time. So as a result, we reject, for example, democratic centralism, in which the democratic centralist organization says it's full and free debate, and then once the decision is made, then you have revolutionary discipline and everyone carries it out. Well, as I think some critics of revolutionary centralism have pointed out, there's a lot more centralism to democratic centralism than there is democracy in it. And so what we do is we collectively debate, we set policy, we implement it, but members are free to disagree with our policy even after the decisions are made, including publicly, as long as they don't disrupt the attempts to carry them out. They may organize within to change that kind of work we're doing, but we don't enforce that on them. Further, we require, it's a membership organization. We allow for the full and free debate, but we also require accountability of the organization. We also have a transparent political structure, rather than 2 to 3 people running things behind the scenes, claiming that they're not the leaders. So just to think about the strengths and limitations, and I talk about Ruckus here, not so much to try to recruit you all. You all are intelligent enough to make your own decisions about this, and if you're interested in further, I'm happy to talk to you. But because I want you to think about this as a model from which you to critique and develop perhaps your own model of what a cadre organization should look like and to build. My goal here is not to recruit intelligent people who can make their own decisions, but just to help think about the function of an organization in the 21st century. Let's think about some of the strengths and weaknesses of Ruckus. I think some of our strengths is that we have a strong commitment to the intellectual development of our members, and that includes from reading to writing to reading and writing. And we are trying to develop a distinct political pole among radicals. We have a website, Bring the Ruckus, and we try to promote some intelligent, interesting, somewhat different kind of perspective than what you're going to get out the indie media or the info shop, or if you bother to read that wretched site, or the worst website ever. Some websites like that. We're trying to create my goal is to piss off some of you people here. But again, that's probably too easy. Info shop. Or Chuck out, right? Now, internally, I think an example of Ruckus' strength is that Ruckus has weathered 2 very public resignations from members, and we've weathered that, and we haven't collapsed as other organizations I've known or have been part of have collapsed in the midst of those kinds of critiques. I'm happy to talk about that more if you're interested. I think also our organization we are an innovative organization, and we are not sectarian. In other words, I believe firmly that in the 21st century that the old anarchist versus communist distinction is increasingly irrelevant. Not to say that there aren't some real debates and issues there between them, but I do not think this is the distinction, and I do not think cadre organizations should try to say we are an anarchist organization. I don't think there's, I'm an anarchist, I'll be an anarchist, I'll encourage my children to be anarchists, I suppose. But, that's almost a form of personal identification. Our influences include anarchism, they include Marx, they include race trader, they include C.L.R. James. I believe they include the Highlander Folk School of Popular Education. We draw from a variety of sources within the organization, all of which I want, none of which I would seek to purge. And I believe, in fact, I'm probably in the minority of groups of members of the organization who actually identify as an anarchist. And again, to me, it's as sentimental and dear to my heart as anything else. My wife and I are about the same age. I'm 37, and now, when we come to places like San Francisco now, and I go into Pancho Villa, got a burrito, right, and there's a bunch of punk rockers eating burritos, and I'm just like, that's just like in the 80s when I used to, see the punk rockers go to get Pancho Villas like me, and before it'd be like, oh, cool, I want to make friends with those, man. We can, do some politics, do some struggle, or drink some beer or something. And now, like my wife says, just look at them now and think, they're so cute. So cute. And that's so. So those differences are cute but not relevant anymore. And they don't bog us down in the organization. The cute anarchists. and the less cute anarchists too. There's also little radical posturing in the organization. In other words, I think there's a rather nuanced understanding of how power works in the society, and an understanding that sometimes apparently liberal reforms can have radical implications. Anyone whose analysis is rooted in the Civil War and in the Civil Rights Movement